So this is a sermon that was written a little over a year ago, but got rewritten again for you because I wasn't satisfied with it. So you know how it is when you rewrite something. It's actually a lot harder than to write it from scratch. But I'm very excited about this topic still. The narrative. Who owns the narrative? Who gets to tell the narrative? Who gets to change it? How does it get to be that way? Both for our personal lives. Who knows the narrative of your life? How would they tell it? How would you tell it? And how would we tell the narrative of our country? So I begin. In an interview with Jeffrey Goldberg, the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic magazine, which, by the way, was started by many Unitarian people in the mid-1800s, Jeffrey Goldberg interviewed the former President Barack Obama. And he revealed one of the most difficult challenges of his second term in office in that interview. It was the normalization of misinformation. The normalization of misinformation. And he defined disinformation as presenting incorrect facts because of carelessness. Maybe Murphy was only 30 years old and I just happened to say he was 31. In his words, misinformation is this: a systematic effort to promote false information or suppress true information for the purpose of political, financial gain, to enhance power, targeting those you don't like. With misinformation, there's a conscious agenda. And in that same interview, Obama told the audience, we underestimate how pliable our opinions are. When we have a more complete understanding of a situation, it changes our relationship to ourselves, to our neighbors, as well as people who do not look like ourselves. I think it's fair to say that we are witnessing masterfully devised misinformation right now. And it's affecting the narrative of our country, and how we understand ourselves has been shaken. There are many ways a narrative becomes ingrained in our culture as the accepted truth. There's all that is said, all that talking, and all that we read. And we know that repetition is important, even if it's the most bizarre fact, not correct fact, but just gets repeated again and again. That has power. And the majority of people process information visually for learning. They said at least 65% of the people are visual learners. And so it is incredibly influential, what we see around us: murals, statues. Writer and independent film distributor Ava DuVernay said, monuments and memorials echo with legacy, loyalty, and love in ways that are heard across multiple generations. Historians and social commentators look back to the Civil War to understand the racial tension we experience today in our society. The issues of that war have not been resolved. It's shocking, but it is true. So I'm going to say, take a little walk with me through the past few years for just a couple of incidents. It's not so long ago that the City Council of Charlottesville, North Carolina, voted to remove the statue of Robert E. Lee. And on August 12, 2017, crowds of white supremacists marched through the streets carrying Confederate and Nazi flags, burning torches intentionally reminiscent of the KKK, who hunted African Americans who dared to do anything to advance their lives. On that August night, the marchers proudly chanted slogans, not fearing any retribution, and they raged, "You will not replace us. Jews will not replace us, and white lives matter." On January 6th, 2021, white supremacists, enraged and disillusioned by the results of the Democratic election, merged at the U.S. Capitol. And one of the images that captured the conflicting values of that day was the photo of a man holding an unfurled Confederate flag in front of a painting of abolitionist Senator Charles Sumner, who was beaten on the floor of the Senate after giving an anti-slavery speech in 1856. The Confederate flag is a symbol of many things, but the fight to maintain slavery is one of them. Sumner's life was dedicated to the equality of the races. And so the photo in the newspapers encapsulates one of the true narratives, I'm afraid, of the United States. It's not our ideal of what democracy should be, but that narrative is the struggle about equality that surfaces repeatedly in our history. It's not a pretty narrative, but it's real. When there are complex dynamics, the narrative is so often simplified to represent what we want the truth to be, what we wish it could be. The interpretation of the Civil War was simplified. The North, the Union, may have won on the battlefield, but in the decades that followed, the Southern Confederates were able to reframe the war's narrative. Ty Sedul, a professor emeritus of history at West Point and the author of Robert E. Lee and Me, documented how the interpretation of the war between the North and the South became misinformation. In the years following 1865, unifying the country and healing the rift between North and South was an economic necessity if the United States was going to survive. There are other examples of what happened, in addition to what I'll share with you now, but when a president or a member of Congress needed a vote from a Southern legislator for the good of the whole country, records show that favors were bestowed or votes were bartered. The trade for a vote was to erect monuments or name military bases and plantations to commemorate Southern leaders for their bravery, their gallantry, their vision. In 1935, Roosevelt needed votes to pass the Social Security Act. And this is undeniably for the good of the vulnerable in a country, right? It's the Social Security Act that we have now. In exchange for some Southern votes that he very much needed, he agreed to change the name of a fort from a general who fought for the Union to the name of a slave plantation. The name change meant nothing to Roosevelt, but pleased those who held on to the glory of the Southern dream. This kind of concession seemed to be a harmless act of appeasement. They soothed the bitterness felt by Southern politicians, as well as the Southerners who were left with this continuing economic hardship of the Southern land. One of the most tragic examples of misinformation was the portrayal of Robert E. Lee. He was notorious for dividing enslaved families and selling them to different plantations in the Deep South. This is where you could make the most money, and he was almost always in economic need. By the beginning of the Civil War, only one family on his enslaved labor farm remained together. He had sold all of the families to different plantations in the Deep South. As a military leader, Lee was one reason why there was so much devastation and destruction throughout the South. He refused offers to surrender long after it was clear that the South had lost the war. And here's why. He believed in slavery. He was horrified at the possibility of those who were enslaved being freed. The loss of social hierarchy would be a fate worse than death, he had said. So, in 1936, another favor was bestowed by President Franklin Roosevelt, who needed more Southern votes in Congress. He spoke of Lee as a war hero, a great general for all of the United States, and one of the greatest American gentlemen. With these words spoken, Lee was transformed into a stately country gentleman of honor. And in truth, he was not a great general, and he was not a gentleman. Statues of Lee's likeness were built throughout the country, and bit by bit, vote by vote, favor by favor, the history of the Civil War era was simplified and compromised. Monuments honoring Lee and other Southern heroes were constructed between 1890 and 1930, when lynching peaked in the South. The Confederate monuments that went up after World War II, and there were many, were a response against integration and equal rights. They were visual reminders, you see. The Confederate monuments were intended to remind society, especially African Americans, that the ideals of the Confederacy were a worthy legacy. It's no surprise that monuments in our public spaces have become the focal point of battles of race. Bryan Stevenson, one of our country's leading Black social activists, wrote, "Iconography and monuments tell essential truths about a community and a nation. America's landscape is littered with misguided totems of hate, intolerance, and bigotry." Is this the narrative of our country that we wish to own? Is this the narrative we wish to give to future generations? What do we do with the 1,741 public symbols of the Confederacy, statues and memorials, plantations that exist across the country? In 2020, the demonstrations concerning George Floyd, protesters converged on an enormous statue of Robert E. Lee, and why might he be the focus of attention? He was on his beloved horse in the statue in Richmond, Virginia. Protesters defaced the statue with paint and graffiti. It was an explosion of anger against the history of racism. There was a larger message, though, to be given, larger than that rage, and someone took the opportunity to take care of that. At night, in the darkness, the statue became the surface for the projected images of Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., George Floyd, and other Black people who had been leaders and visionaries, prophets, martyrs. Yes, Lee is a part of the history, but the images of those he would oppress at night, they outshone his presence. This reflected the fuller American story. Yes, oppression. And there is all the rest. The remorse, the bravery, the courage, the endurance, so many feelings, and the hope. When shaping the American narrative or the narrative of any individual's life, we benefit from knowing the complexity of the circumstances of the times. To simplify the story does a disservice to the people of that time and the generations that follow. Help us to know the pressures that people lived with and to witness the results of those decisions. We live in messy times. So show us their messy times too. Show us their struggles. Here's the message of hope to send us into the week ahead, where we will, once again, I can guarantee it, probably for the next how many months, witness misinformation. This time that we have is an opportunity to creatively reimagine how we present the history of our country. I just stumbled onto this. The Mellon Foundation, the nation's largest supporter of the arts and humanities, started the Monument Project in 2020, and it will continue until 2025. There's a total of $250 million, $250 million, to create more inclusive stories and to expand the American telling of history. The goal is for future generations to inherit a memorial landscape that reflects the rich complexity of the American experience. Robert E. Lee's statue and the images that were projected on it through the night in Richmond, Virginia, was not one of their projects, but it's reminiscent of what they are looking to do. Because of the foundation's work, sometimes new monuments will be built. Other historic sites will add context and education. Sometimes the statues and memorials will be relocated. There are historic spaces that include community involvement, where community members are a part of creating murals showing the multiracial story of that community. And in some cases, there's an assumption that the display will not be permanent, but the content will change over time as new heroic people emerge in our time. Not just a statue that stays the same. Something eternal, like change, is a part of it. One project is the Great Wall of Los Angeles, and they're expanding one of the country's largest monuments to interracial harmony. The artist is Judith Baca, and she said that the most overwhelming part of this process of their mural making was learning about the courage of the individuals who endured and spoke up and overcame unsurmountable obstacles. So as they were painting these people, they were learning about them. It was true, she said, both about the people's images they painted and the lives of the local mural painters themselves from the community. They were unsung heroes, and each life, each person painting had moments of heroism to be recognized, and that is inspirational. Statues will continue to exist, but this is my interpretation. Rarely will one person be given total credit for the outcome of pivotal change. Someone may be central to a change, but they rarely act without a community to accompany them to that moment when their courage is required. If we see heroic people in this way, maybe more people will recognize the importance of their efforts in bringing forward important change. It's undeniable that misinformation has the power to sway minds of vulnerable people. And as former President Obama said, we are all more vulnerable than we realize. But when we believe that we are going to hell in a handbasket, remember the part of our faith that comes from the Universalists. We are, after all, Unitarian Universalists. They always looked for reason to hope, no matter how small that might be. They would hold on to that as a tool to sustain their strength. Hope is found because truthful information is being planted. We see the misinformation in the news, but we rarely see this kind of information that is also happening more quietly in the background. We will see an emerging landscape that reveals more of what people value and what kinds of things people want to remember, like new legacy, new loyalty, and new love. Who owns the narrative? It's going to be a struggle. And to that I say, amen.